The candles in Lord Finch's entrance hall had been lit 2 hours before the first carriage arrived, and by the time Charlotte Ashby stepped inside, they had burned low enough to throw her face half into shadow. She stood to the right of the double doors, while Eliza walked through them, and she watched her sister's ivory gown catch the light from the ballroom beyond, and she told herself that standing in the hall was sensible, that it was practical, that a woman with no dowry and no prospects had no business in a ballroom at the height of a season she could not afford to enter, and that watching from the threshold was its own kind of dignity. She had almost persuaded herself of it when she heard the voice of Lady Alderton, the Duke of Windermere's godmother, and the season's most efficient cartographer of other people's worth, carry cleanly across the marble floor. "The elder one," Lady Alderton said, to someone Charlotte could not see. "The younger is unaccompanied, and has nothing to recommend her." Charlotte's hands did not move. She was good at that. She had been practicing stillness since her father's creditors began arriving at the Ashby house in Derbyshire 4 months ago, and she had learned to hold her body very still when a thing landed that she could not answer. She pressed her fingers flat against the seam of her gown, which was a pale gray that had been retrimmed once already and would not survive another season, and she breathed. What she did not yet know was that the Duke of Windermere had heard the same words from across the hall and had turned, not toward Eliza, but toward the woman standing motionless in the shadow of the doorway, and that what he saw there had made him go very still himself. The Ashby daughters had come to Lord Finch's autumn ball on the strength of a long-standing invitation, a relic of happier years when their father, Mr. Thomas Ashby, had been a man of modest but unencumbered property. He had died in June, peacefully enough in his own bed, and the estate he left behind was less peaceful. £4,200 in accumulated debts, a house in entail to a distant male cousin who had already written twice about his intention to claim it, and 2 daughters whose futures now depended entirely on the willingness of some sufficiently wealthy man to overlook the arithmetic of their situation. Eliza, 23, with her father's fair coloring and a gentleness that expressed itself in every gesture, was the visible asset. Charlotte, 21, with her father's mind and a face that the world had simply decided not to look at closely, was the problem to be managed. Their mother had died when Charlotte was 6. Their father had educated Charlotte himself, out of love and a mild disregard for convention, and she had read more widely than most men she met, and had learned to show no evidence of it in company. She had his miniature in her dress pocket, a small oval painting on ivory in a worn silver frame, and she had carried it every day since the funeral. She did not take it out in public. It was simply there, a weight she had mapped onto her body so thoroughly that its absence would have felt like missing a bone. Eliza found her in the hall between the first and second sets and pressed her hand. "You should come inside," Eliza said quietly. She meant it kindly, and Charlotte knew it, and she shook her head. "I would rather not stand in the center of a room where I am an inconvenience," Charlotte said. Eliza's expression was the particular one she wore when she could not argue with a thing and wished she could. "Lady Alderton has pointed his grace toward me," she said, lower still. "He has not yet appeared to notice." This was the second thing Charlotte did not yet understand, that the Duke had already appeared, had already noticed, and that the specific quality of his attention was nothing at all like the attention Lady Alderton had intended for him to pay. James Calder, Duke of Windermere, was 34 years old and had inherited his title at 22, when his father died of a fever that moved faster than any physician could track. He was tall, with a jaw that carried the kind of set that came not from arrogance, but from long practice of suppressing whatever moved beneath it, and he had gray eyes that a less charitable observer might have called cold and that a more accurate one would have called watchful. He had been watchful for a long time. He had been directed toward Eliza Ashby by his godmother, with the quiet efficiency Lady Alderton brought to all her projects, and he had crossed the room toward the introduction, with the equally quiet efficiency he brought to every obligation. He had passed through the double doors. He had registered the hall. He had seen the woman in gray standing alone beside the wall, not hiding, not performing composure, simply occupying her space with a quality of stillness that was not resignation and was not defeat, and was, he realized, with the specific clarity that his watchfulness sometimes produced, the most honest thing he had seen in this house all evening. He had stopped walking. He had stood there for perhaps 4 seconds, which was a very long time for a man who never stood anywhere without purpose. And then Lady Alderton had appeared at his elbow and steered him smoothly into the ballroom, and the introduction to Eliza had proceeded as planned. He was perfectly civil. He asked the correct questions. He noticed that Eliza Ashby was kind, and that her smile was genuine, and he noticed that he was thinking about her sister. This was not something he examined. He filed it, the way he filed most things that complicated his intentions, under a category with no useful action attached, and he returned his attention to the room. He was not a man who acted on things he had not yet examined. If you have found yourself settling into this story already, you are in good company. Stay close. Charlotte's situation is about to become a great deal more difficult before it becomes anything else. The Ashby debt did not remain a private matter for long. 3 days after Lord Finch's ball, a solicitor named Mr. Graves arrived at the house where Charlotte and Eliza were staying with their mother's cousin, Mrs. Vane, in Cavendish Street. He carried papers, and he sat at the small table in the back parlor with his hat on the chair beside him, and he explained in a voice designed for precision rather than comfort that the £4,200 their father had owed at the time of his death had accrued interest at a rate that was no longer sustainable, and that the cousin who stood to inherit the entailed property had already engaged his own solicitor to begin proceedings. Mrs. Vane, who was kind, but had 3 daughters of her own and a limited income, sat with her hands folded and said nothing. Eliza sat very straight. Charlotte asked 3 questions about the debt schedule that made Mr. Graves look up from his papers with an expression that was not quite surprise, and then she thanked him and saw him out, and came back to the parlor and told her sister that the situation was exactly as it appeared, and that they had perhaps 2 months before the house question became urgent. The matter of the Duke's invitation arrived the following week. The Duke of Windermere was assembling a small party at his Derbyshire estate for the fortnight following the Michaelmas ball. The list of invitations had been managed by Lady Alderton with characteristic precision, and it included Eliza Ashby as one of several young women judged suitable for the Duke's consideration. The invitation to Mrs. Vane's household extended, by a narrow margin of social courtesy, to the younger Miss Ashby as well. Charlotte read the card twice and set it on the mantel. "You should not come if you do not wish to," Eliza said. "I should not come regardless of what I wish," Charlotte said. "The invitation is a formality. Lady Alderton will have counted me as furniture." She came anyway. She told herself it was because Eliza needed her, and this was partially true. She told herself it was because Mrs. Vane's house was increasingly small for the weight of the situation it contained, and this was also true. She did not examine the third reason, which lived somewhere in the vicinity of 4 seconds of stillness in a hall that she had not managed to stop thinking about. Windermere was a long, pale house in a fold of the Derbyshire hills, its stone the color of winter light, its gardens running to formality at the front and to something wilder at the sides where an old orchard pressed against the wall. Charlotte arrived in the second carriage with Mrs. Vane and a young woman named Miss Forsyth, who had been talking without pause since Nottingham. She stepped out into the courtyard, looked at the house, and felt something she had not felt since her father died, which was the sensation of a place that might have stories she would want to know. The Duke stood at the top of the steps, with 2 footmen flanking the door, and Lady Alderton at his right side like a general at a review. He greeted each guest with correct minimal warmth. When Charlotte reached him, there was a beat, no longer than a breath, before he said, "Miss Ashby." And something in the way he said it, not Miss Eliza Ashby, not the younger Miss Ashby, but simply Miss Ashby, as though she were the one who merited the unqualified form, sat at the back of her mind for the rest of the afternoon. Lady Alderton did not let it sit anywhere. She turned to Mrs. Vane as they moved into the house and said, clearly enough for the 3 people nearest her to hear, "The younger Miss Ashby. One wonders at the generosity of the invitation." It was not said cruelly. It was said in exactly the tone of mild curiosity one might use to wonder at an unusual arrangement of the furniture, and that particular quality of pleasantness made it worse, not better. Windmere was a house that held its life in compartments. The guests gathered in the drawing room for the evenings and walked the grounds in the afternoons, and Lady Alderton steered the composition of each occasion with the confidence of someone who had been steering such occasions for 40 years. Harriet Pemworth, her preferred candidate, was beautiful in a way that had been carefully assembled, with dark hair dressed very high and a manner that matched the setting with uncanny precision, and she moved through the rooms as though she had already been told she would live in them. Charlotte watched her from the edges and felt no particular animosity. Harriet was a person who had been told her entire life that she was the correct choice. The problem was not Harriet. The problem was the structure that produced her. Charlotte found the library on the second afternoon and went there because it was the one room that asked nothing of her. She was reading beside the window when she heard the door open, and she looked up expecting a footman. And it was the Duke. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at the book in her hands, which was a history of the Peninsular Campaign that he had presumably placed on his own shelf. And his expression did not change, but something behind it shifted slightly. "I should not be here," she said. "You are here," he said, which was not the same thing, and sat down in the chair across the window from her without further comment. They read in the same room for 40 minutes. It was the strangest and most companionable 40 minutes Charlotte had experienced since her father was alive, and she left before she could become too comfortable in it. Tobias was the Duke's ward, a boy of 9 years old with his father's fair coloring and a particular silence that was not the silence of a happy child. He was the son of the Duke's younger brother, dead of a fever 2 winters past, and the Duke had taken him in without apparent ceremony, as he appeared to do everything. Tobias moved through the house at the edges, appearing at the boundaries of rooms and then withdrawing, and the guests treated him as one treats a piece of furniture one is not certain how to use. Charlotte noticed him on the 3rd morning, sitting alone at the end of the breakfast table after the other guests had risen, turning a small toy soldier over and over in his hands. She sat down across from him without asking permission and said, "What is his regiment?" Tobias looked up. He had the eyes of someone who had learned not to expect questions addressed to him directly. "The 42nd, he said after a pause. "The Black Watch," Charlotte said. "They were at Quatre Bras, though that was last year. Are you giving him an earlier engagement?" Tobias turned the soldier over again, more slowly. "Salamanca," he said, barely audible. She talked to him about Salamanca for 20 minutes, drawing on her father's histories and her own reading. And by the end of it, Tobias had stopped turning the soldier and was listening with the specific attention of a child who has been recognized. She did not tell him anything false. She answered his questions as directly as she could, including the difficult ones about casualties. And she watched him absorb the answers with a seriousness that was not morbid, but was simply honest. And she thought that he was a child who could be trusted with the truth and had not previously been offered it. The following afternoon, Lady Alderton conducted what she would have called a guided conversation in the drawing room with several of the female guests, and, crucially, with Tobias, who had the misfortune to appear in the doorway at the wrong moment. Lady Alderton called him in, and the assembled guests looked at him with the varied expressions of people who find children either charming or inconvenient. And Lady Alderton said, in her pleasantest voice, that he must come and demonstrate his manners to the company, since she had been hearing rather troubling reports about his tendency to haunt the house like a small ghost. She meant it as a light correction. She did not see the way Tobias's face went blank, the particular blankness of a child swallowing something that would have been tears if he had permitted it. And she continued speaking, addressing the room, sketching a gentle picture of a boy who was perhaps somewhat wild for want of proper guidance, and smiling with the benevolence of someone who considers herself to be helping. "That is not true," Charlotte said. The room went quiet. Lady Alderton turned to look at her with the expression of a person who has been interrupted during a prayer. "Tobias is not wild," Charlotte said evenly. "He is precise. He is better informed on the Peninsular campaigns than most of the officers I have met in drawing rooms, and his manner this morning was exactly what a gentleman's ought to be. He requires no correction before an audience." She did not raise her voice. She looked at Lady Alderton with the level attention of someone who has decided that the cost of silence is higher than the cost of speaking. And she waited. The silence lasted long enough to be a verdict. Lady Alderton smiled. It was the smile she used when she intended to return to a subject at a more advantageous moment. "How very spirited," she said. What Charlotte could not know was that the Duke was in the doorway behind her, which she could not see. He had come looking for Tobias at the boy's usual hour, knowing Tobias sometimes needed finding. He had heard the whole of it. He stood in the corridor with his hand on the doorframe and watched his ward's face change from the blank protective absence to something that was not yet hope, but was adjacent to it. And he felt the particular loosening in his chest that he associated with very few things and had not expected to feel in his own drawing room. He did not announce himself. He withdrew before anyone turned, and he stood in the corridor outside for a moment. And then he walked to the window at the end of the passage that looked over the south gardens, and he stood there, with his hand still open at his side. She had known about the 42nd foot. She had sat down across from Tobias without being asked, without being instructed, without calculating whether it was to her advantage. She had defended the boy before his godmother's formidable assembled opinion, and had done it without theater, without appeal to sentiment, without any of the social machinery available to her. She had simply said what was true. He had loved his wife, Catherine, with the specific attention he brought to everything he valued, and he had been attending to estate business in London when the letter arrived from Windermere, 4 years past now, and by the time he reached her, the fever had gone further than the physicians had admitted to him in their correspondence. She had lived long enough to take his hand. The child had not lived at all. He had stood in the room for a long time afterward, in the particular silence of a man who has measured the gap between his duty and his care, and found it wider than he had permitted himself to know. And he had returned to the business of the title and the estate, and had done his work with the discipline of a man who has decided that the world functions best when he remains exactly inside his prescribed function. He had not, in the 4 years since, been interrupted. If this story is moving you, you are not alone in it. Stay with Charlotte. The harder part is coming. The Michaelmas ball at Windermere was an occasion the household assembled for with the efficient tension of a well-rehearsed ceremony. The house had been lent an additional glitter for the evening, extra candles in the reception rooms, the long dining table set for 30, the musicians brought from Derby arranged at the far end of the ballroom. Charlotte dressed in her gray gown, which was the only evening gown she had brought, and she looked at herself in the small glass in the room she shared with Mrs. Vane, and permitted herself one precise observation, that she looked like a governess who had been invited by oversight, and that this was accurate, and that accuracy had the advantage of requiring no further adjustment. Eliza knocked and came in and looked at her for a moment, and then said, "You are the most honest person I have ever known, and I hope someone sees it tonight." Charlotte thought of their father and of his miniature in her pocket, and said only, "I hope you enjoy yourself." The early part of the evening proceeded under Lady Alderton's direction. Harriet was magnificent in a gown of deep copper silk, and received the room's attention with the serenity of someone who had never doubted her own coordinates. The Duke moved through the company with his measured efficiency, performing the obligations of a host with perfect correctness, and Charlotte watched him from the side of the room and told herself that the library had been a contained incident, and that she was not a person who built castles on the foundation of 40 minutes of companionable silence. She was watching Tobias, who had been permitted to attend the early part of the evening, when Lady Alderton found her. "Miss Ashby," Lady Alderton said, with the pleasantness she kept polished for these occasions, "I wonder if you might do me the kindness of explaining to me what you were about yesterday in the drawing-room." "I was correcting a mischaracterization," Charlotte said. "You were overstepping," Lady Alderton said, still pleasantly. "You are here by the extension of a courtesy, Miss Ashby. You carry debts of £4,200 against an estate that will not survive the year. You have no position, no income, and no connections of sufficient weight. You are here because the invitation was broad and because your sister is a charming girl, and the kindness you are being shown does not extend to the public embarrassment of your betters." She paused. "I say this as someone who wishes you well enough to be honest." Charlotte's hands were flat against the seam of her gown. She heard the sentence. She measured the cost of the response forming in her throat, and the cost of swallowing it. And she understood that Lady Alderton expected the second option, because it was the correct one for a woman in Charlotte's position, and because the season had never failed to collect it. She looked at Lady Alderton and said, quietly and without inflection, "Tobias is 9 years old. He was afraid, and the room was invited to confirm it. I would do the same again." Lady Alderton's expression did not change. Something behind it did. "I see," she said, and moved away. Within the hour, the ground had shifted. Charlotte felt it the way one feels a change in weather before the clouds arrive, in the small adjustments of attention around her. Mrs. Pemworth, Harriet's mother, managed to arrive at Charlotte's side during the second set, and ask with exquisite kindness whether Miss Ashby was perhaps finding the evening rather long, and whether she had considered that some guests preferred the library. 2 other women whom Charlotte recognized as Lady Alderton's particular associates passed her without acknowledgement. The category had been confirmed. She was, publicly and by consensus, an inappropriate candidate, a woman of no means and insufficient discretion, and the room now knew it. She saw the Duke, at that moment, standing at the far end of the room near the windows, and she saw Lady Alderton reach him and bend her head toward his, and she watched his face as he received whatever Lady Alderton was saying, and she saw nothing change in it. Not relief. Not agreement. Not the particular small contraction that would have told her the case was being closed. Simply the watchfulness she had been cataloging, without meaning to, since the entrance hall. It did not matter. Or so she told herself, turning toward the nearest door, intending to find Tobias and ask about the black watch, and be useful in the one way that was still available to her. She had reached the edge of the floor when she heard it. Mrs. Pemworth, speaking to Mrs. Vane, at a volume calibrated for carrying. A pity about the younger Miss Ashby, spirited certainly, a governess's prospects and a governess's manners. One cannot expect the Duke to look twice. Charlotte stopped walking. She stood on the edge of the floor with the musicians playing behind her and 30 people between her and the door, and she felt the cold of the words settle across her shoulders. She thought about her father, and about his careful handwriting in the margins of the histories they had read together, and about Tobias's face when she had said the word Salamanca, and he had recognized that she meant it. She thought about Eliza, who was dancing with a pleasant young lord, and deserved to keep dancing. She thought about the house in Derbyshire that would belong to a cousin in 2 months, and the debt schedule Mr. Graves had laid out with such precision, and the gray gown that would not survive another season. She could leave the room. It was the correct thing to do. It was what the situation required. She turned around instead. She turned around and she walked back to the center of the floor, not because she had a plan, but because she had decided, in the way she decided most things, that the cost of the retreat would compound, and she had given enough ground tonight already. She found Tobias near the fireplace, where he had been standing alone for some time, and she crossed to him, and she said, low and clear, "Come and stand with me. You should not be by yourself at the edge of your own house." Tobias looked at her. He looked at the room. He took 1 step forward and stood beside her, and Charlotte stood next to him on the floor of the Windmere Ballroom and let the room look at them both. And she held her spine straight and did not perform either confidence or apology. The Duke was not looking at Lady Alderton anymore. He had been listening to his godmother with the portion of his attention he kept available for things that required management, and the rest of it had been elsewhere, as it had been elsewhere repeatedly, and without his full permission for the past 10 days. He had heard Mrs. Pemworth's observation. He had seen Charlotte stop walking. He had watched her turn around. He had understood, in the specific clarity that his watchfulness produced, exactly what the choice had cost, and exactly what it said about the person making it, and something in him that had been very still for 4 years proved. He crossed the ballroom in 3 strides. The crowd did not part for him exactly, but it adjusted, the way water adjusts around a stone, and the adjustment produced a cleared line of movement from where he stood to where Charlotte stood with Tobias beside her. And every person in the room understood that this was happening before they understood what it was. He stopped in front of Charlotte. He looked at her for a moment, and she looked back at him. And her expression was the one from the entrance hall, not performing composure, simply occupying her space with the honest quality that had stopped him walking 2 weeks ago. "Miss Charlotte Ashby," he said. He used her first name. He said it before the room, before Lady Alderton, before Harriet Pemworth in her copper silk, before Mrs. Vane and Mrs. Pemworth and Lord Finch, and 30 other people who understood Regency social arithmetic well enough to calculate exactly what a duke's use of a woman's Christian name before a full assembly signified. He said it with the level, deliberate precision of a man making a declaration that he had no intention of revisiting. "Would you do me the honor of this dance?" Charlotte heard the room shift around her the way a room shifts when its conclusion has been revised. She heard Lady Alderton, at the periphery of her awareness, say something to the woman beside her in a voice that was slightly smaller than it had been, the pleasantness thinned to something that required effort to sustain. She heard Tobias breathe beside her, and felt the small warmth of him standing very close. She said, "Yes, Your Grace." He took her hand. It was a formal gesture, entirely correct, and the warmth of it through her glove arrived at the base of her throat and stayed there. They moved to the floor, and the musicians, with the professional sensitivity of men who had been playing in great houses long enough to read the weather of a room, settled into a slower measure, and the assembly watched James Calder, Duke of Windermere, dance with Charlotte Ashby, who wore a gray gown that had been retrimmed once already and carried £4,200 in debt and a worn miniature in her pocket, and who held herself, through the entire dance, with the honest, upright quality that he had first seen in a hall 12 days ago, and had not managed to stop seeing since. Lady Alderton stood by the window for the duration of the dance, and said nothing further. Harriet Pemworth excused herself from the floor and went to speak with her mother in a low voice, and her expression contained something that was not quite the thing she had carried all evening, the serene confidence of the correctly chosen. It was quieter than that, and more honest, and not without its own dignity. She had been told her whole life that she was the right answer, and she had believed it, and she was in the process of understanding, not with malice but with the particular clarity of an unlooked-for moment, that the right answer in this room was not hers. Eliza watched from the side of the floor with her hand pressed to her mouth and her eyes very bright. The dance ended. The Duke did not release Charlotte's hand immediately. He held it for a moment in the correct, formal manner, which was not long, but was long enough, and said quietly, in a register that did not carry to the room, "I owe Tobias an apology. I should have been paying closer attention." Charlotte looked at him. She thought of the silence in the drawing room when she had said what was true, and of the 40 minutes in the library, and of the way he had said Miss Ashby at the top of the steps as though she were the one worth naming. "He will recover," she said. "He is more resilient than you think." "I am beginning to understand," the Duke said, "that I have thought about a number of things less accurately than I believed." She did not answer. She had learned to be careful with hope. There was a particular danger in it. For a woman in her position, in mistaking attention for intention, and she had protected herself against it for long enough that the habit was deeply set. He saw her hold the careful distance. Careful. He saw it in the exact way he saw most things, which was clearly. And he recognized what it was. He said in a lower register still, "I should like your permission to speak with you tomorrow morning. Properly. With Mrs. Vane present, if you prefer." Charlotte's hands were still. The room was still present around them, and the musicians were beginning the next piece, and Lady Alderton was somewhere at the periphery like a reckoning deferred, but not dismissed. She looked at the Duke and understood, with the honest perception that had always been her best quality, that this was not a managed moment. He was not performing. He was as uncertain as she was, and he had more to lose by the uncertainty. And he was standing in front of her in his own ballroom saying so. "Yes," she said. "Tomorrow morning." The morning came gray and cold, with the first real edge of winter in the air and a low white sky that suggested snow by the afternoon. Mrs. Vane sat in the corner of the small morning room with a cup of tea and the studied inattentiveness of a chaperone who has decided to be useful by being nearly invisible. The Duke arrived promptly, which Charlotte had expected, and sat across from her in the unadorned chair she had once thought was the most honest piece of furniture in the house, and he spoke without preamble. He told her about Catherine. He told her in the measured, careful sentences of a man who has held a thing for a long time and is learning to set it down, and he said that his wife had died in the 4th year of their marriage of a fever that moved quickly, and that he had not been there, and that he had lived for the 4 years since inside the specific arithmetic of that choice, which was that he had been in London attending to the title's obligations when the message came, and that by the time he arrived it was already the last hour, and that he had held her hand, and she had known him, and he had not been able to tell whether the recognition was comfort or one more thing he had arrived too late to make right. He told her about the child, briefly. He looked at the window while he said it. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. She thought about the miniature in her pocket and about her father's handwriting and about the specific shape of a grief that has been carried alone for long enough to become load-bearing. She said, "You were doing what he asked of you. Your title, your obligations. Those are not failures." "I know that," he said. He looked at her. "I have known it intellectually for some time. It is a different matter to feel it as true." "Yes," she said. "It is." They sat with that for a moment in the morning room, with Mrs. Vane's teacup making small sounds in the corner, and it was not unlike the library, except that it was more honest than the library and cost more. He told her about Tobias, then. That the boy had been silent since he arrived. That the Duke had arranged tutors and suitable clothing. And a horse appropriate to his size, and had not, he said, with the precision of a man charging himself accurately, arranged much in the way of company. That he had watched the boy moving at the edges of rooms, and had told himself it was the natural reserve of a recently bereaved child, and had not asked the correct questions, because he was a man who had learned to live inside his own reserve and had forgotten that 9-year-old boys should not be expected to do the same. Charlotte said, "He is not unreachable. He only needs someone to sit down first." The Duke looked at her with something in his eyes that was, for the first time in the entirety of her acquaintance with him, fully present. "Yes," he said. "I noticed that." He made his offer formally and clearly, with Mrs. Vane as witness, and Charlotte accepted it in the same register. There was nothing theatrical about it. It was 2 people at a table in the morning, both of them understanding the terms precisely and agreeing to them without performing agreement, and Charlotte thought that this was the right way to begin a thing. The snow arrived that afternoon, as the sky had promised. It came softly at first, in the tentative way of early season snow that is still deciding, and then with more conviction, settling over the Windmere Gardens and the old orchard against the wall and the courtyard where the carriages had come and gone. Charlotte stood at the long window in the upstairs passage and watched it come down. Tobias found her there. He had been told by the Duke, in a private conversation that Charlotte was not present for, but heard about afterward from Mrs. Vane with a quality of warmth in her voice that suggested it had gone well, that the Duke would be very glad of his company at the breakfast table from now on. He stood beside Charlotte at the window and looked at the snow for a while without speaking. Then he said, "Will you stay?" Charlotte looked at him, and at the garden filling white below them, and at the house in its fold of hills, with its stories she had only begun to know. She thought of the gray gown that would not survive another season, and the debt schedule and the cousin's letters and everything the season had assembled to tell her about her worth. And she thought of her father's miniature, solid in her pocket, and of the 40 minutes in the library, and of the Duke's voice saying her name before the room. "Yes," she said, "I will stay." Tobias nodded once, with the gravity of a child who has asked the one question that mattered and received an honest answer. Then he put his hand in hers, not as a gesture of sentiment, but as the simplest possible confirmation that the conversation had resolved correctly, and they stood at the window together and watched Windmere take the snow. That winter settled early over the Derbyshire hills, covering the old orchard and the formal gardens and the pale stone of the house in a quiet that was different from the quiet of Charlotte's preceding months, which had been the quiet of things held back. Eliza came for Christmas, staying in the East Wing with Mrs. Vane's blessing and the Duke's open invitation, and she and Charlotte walked the grounds in the mornings and talked about their father with a freedom that the debt and the urgency and the Cavendish Street parlor had not permitted. Eliza had received an offer of her own before the season closed, from the pleasant young lord she had danced with at the Windmere Ball, and she brought the news with a happiness that was warm and unperformed. And Charlotte held her sister in the cold garden and felt, for the first time since June, that the weight of the arithmetic had been distributed into something more bearable. Mr. Graves returned in December with the documentation confirming that the £4,200 of the Ashby estate's debts had been discharged in full by a transaction that Mr. Graves described in his measured way as having been arranged through the offices of the Duke's solicitor. Charlotte did not ask the Duke about it directly. She found him in the library that evening, which had become a reliable location for finding him at that hour, and she said only, "The debt." He looked up from his correspondence. He said, "I was not willing to have it standing between us. It would have interfered with my ability to know with certainty what your answer meant." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of sentence that explained a great deal about him, and she found that she was not angry and was not managed by it, but felt instead the particular recognition of a person who has been seen accurately by someone paying genuine attention. She sat down in the chair across the window from him, as she had the first afternoon, and opened the book she had brought with her. And he returned to his correspondence, and the fire crackled in the grate behind them, and the snow came down outside the window, and neither of them found it necessary to say anything further. The miniature of her father had lived in her pocket for 7 months. On the evening of the last day of the year, Charlotte placed it on the mantelpiece in the room that had become, without formal announcement, hers. She set it between a small candlestick and a piece of stone she had picked up from the garden on her first walk, and she stood back and looked at it. The worn silver frame and her father's careful painted face, and she thought about his handwriting in the margins of histories and his conviction that she was worth educating and the debts he had left behind that had turned out, in the end, to be a passage through which the right life had entered. Tobias came to find her for the evening meal. He had taken to arriving at her door at the correct hour and waiting with the patient precision of a child who has found a reliable person and intends to keep her. He came in and saw the miniature on the mantel and asked about it with the directness she had taught him to expect in return, and she told him about her father, briefly and honestly, and Tobias listened with his full attention and said that he thought her father must have been a good teacher. "He was," Charlotte said. Tobias nodded and held out his hand for the corridor, which was his particular way of indicating that it was time to go, and she took it, and they went down to dinner together, and the Duke looked up when they came in, and his expression was the one he kept for very few things, the one where the watchfulness had been replaced by something simpler and less defended, and Charlotte met it without looking away. The season's noise was very far away. The house held them all in its quiet, and outside the windows of Windmere the snow was still coming down, covering everything the year had required of her, and the fire in the dining room was bright, and her father's face was on the mantel above it, and she was home.